The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on collaborating with corporate partners. This series is being brought to you by NCET2, and it's part of the University Startup Development webinar series. Before we begin, I'd like to let you know that the next webinars in this series are on October 25, Fortune 500s, how they think about partnering with startups, and on November 8th on term sheets. So these webinars are scheduled on Wednesdays and begin at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. If you'd like to view the archived webinars, all you need to do is go to ncet2.org/YouTube or go to our webinar page to download the slides or to view videos of the past webinars. We will have Q&A at the end, so just go to the GoToWebinar control panel and search for the questions box. You may enter your questions in the space provided. We will try to get to as many questions in this webinar as we can. However, if we do run out of time, if you have a specific question that you'd like to ask, you can email us at support@ncet2.org. That email address will be sent to you via the chat box, also through your GoToWebinar control panel. The slides and video recording of this webinar will be available at ncet2.org/webinars. It will be available within 24 to 48 hours after this webinar concludes. You may also go to our YouTube channel to watch webinars, this webinar and past webinars in this series. So today we're going to talk about this webinar series and let you know what this webinar series is about. We'll also have a background on the Startup Development Program and how you, if you're a university, a startup, a corporate, or an entrepreneur or a researcher, how you can get involved with us. Then we'll go to the main item of the agenda, which is the talk on collaborating with corporate partners. Then after that, we'll go straight to Q&A. So we'll begin our program now. So our speakers today is the NCET2 Executive Director, Tony Stanko, and one of our NCET2 Corporate Startup Development Officers, Vicky Scarborough. So we're going to start now on the program. So Tony, I'll turn it over now to you.
Okay, thank you, Ria. Welcome, everyone. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about the background of the Startup Development Program. Next slide. So basically, a few years ago, Congress contacted us and said they were looking for new models to commercialize the $137 billion worth of research at universities or federal labs, and specifically wanted to hear what corporates, our Fortune 500 members, thought could be an interesting new model. We set up a summit, and really the model that I'll show on the next slide came out of those discussions. We had roadshows around the country. We started the briefings at Congress, and then we started laying out early parts of the model in demo days late last year and then early this year. And now we're into the other parts of the program, which is the IP to Startup program, to actually start with the IP and help put it into startups in the first place, and develop those startups through the development program with our senior development officers. Ria, next slide. So this is the model. There's a lot here. I'm not going to unpack it all. There's other webinars that you can go to that kind of describe the model. Mostly the insight from the corporates is that they can act as the market, as the IPO market, and as the M&A market, to kind of allow everybody to know what the market's looking for. So instead of having technology push, you can have a market pull. So that's the basic, part of the model. All right, next. So as I said, Congress funds $137 billion. Everybody's looking for more startups, jobs, and economic development to come out of that. So our startup development program addresses that, and it's really a great way for researchers and entrepreneurs to build startups around the IP. If you've tried that, you know how difficult that is without, expert help. And so that's what the SDO program is to have people like Vicky, who's an ex-corporate person, and angels and serial entrepreneurs help researchers and faculty and students create these startups. The other part of this is the Fortune 500, who also, as I mentioned, give you market guidance and will help in some partnerships to kind of move things forward. All right, next. Yeah, so I mentioned this already. You can go to that link and you'll see, I think we have about 15 or so already up. It's a pretty new program. It's only since July. So we have about 15. We want a lot more than that to really create the startups that Congress wants and the corporates want to see off the research. But so far we have about a 25 to 30% rate of acceptance, because our bar is a little bit higher than usual for a lot of these kind of programs, because we're really trying to professionalize it and have a pipeline delivery system to the corporates that really they can depend on and count on. But there's the link, so nset2.org/SDO, and you'll see the current team. Next. So the SDOs will help you with these kind of services. They'll help you set up the corporation. They'll help you with business plans, proof of concept, prototyping, early product development, and then funding from the SBR, Angel, VC, and corporate communities. The way to look at this for universities and researchers is these are commercialization experiments until you get to the product, and because there's a lot of de-risking that has to happen. And so you get to work with the Fortune 500 angels, VCs, and serial entrepreneurs that are startup development officers to help you get through that. So it's a great program for those that have the science background but need help on the commercialization side. All right, next. I'll touch a little bit on benefits. So the benefits for the startups, the entrepreneurs, researchers, students, faculty, you get to work with the Fortune 500 and also these SDO professionals. For the universities, we help you move your IP to the market with the corporates as the ultimate destination, and with the SDOs as helpers to get you there. A big benefit of the program is it helps you graduate your students that have worked on the research into these startups to help commercialize the research. So that's really a huge benefit, and that's a workforce development program in its own right. All right, next. All right, I'm going to pass it over to Vicky at this point to talk about how to partner with corporates and what corporates are looking for, how to position the startup to maximize the opportunity with them. So Vicky, take it away.
Sure. Thank you, Tony. Good afternoon to everyone, or good morning, as the case may be. My name is Vicky Scarborough, and I worked for 35 years in the corporate world, most recently Sherwin-Williams Company, as I was the external technology director. So I spent a lot of time working with startups and technology and trying to bring it to commercialization. Today we want to talk about how to properly collaborate with corporate partners, and really to tell startups, what do they want to know? What do they need to know about me in order to be successful collaboration? So that's the primary discussion today. On the next slide, please, Ria. So, as Tony mentioned, the benefits of working with NSET2 is that the universities supply not only intellectual property, but students for working with startups and working with the Fortune 500s. We work with the Fortune 500s who have their own large businesses in various verticals. They work to de-risk the products and startups that align best to their technologies, their business strategies, and so forth. We also have a network of angel and VC investors who want to, again, to align what they're looking for with the university startups that we are bringing into the system, and the intellectual property as well. So they're looking for more strategic partnerships and their alignments with the kinds of things that they like to invest in. And then finally, NCET 2 is developing a fleet, if you will, of startup development officers, and basically working with the startups and the faculty at the university, as well as the corporate membership, to try to then align the needs with the businesses and bring technology to market. And we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about that in the presentation. Next, please. So for benefits for, obviously for startups, is really you get access to the talent of these professionals, these startup development officers, because basically they've been in business a long time. And so they're going to help align your intellectual property in your startup to the market, to the corporates. And really, the idea is to get an exit as fast as you can. So really what this webinar is designed to do is to talk about how the startup development officers connect you with the corporates for these alliances, and then for you to understand what a corporate really cares about knowing about the startup. So the startup development officers understand this well, but we want to communicate fully about what it is corporates want to know about you. Next, please. So you are able, through NCET 2's website, to as a university, to submit, and we've asked universities to submit all the non-licensed intellectual property that you feel is worthwhile to be considered by a number of corporate members that we have. And or you can also submit your startup companies, and all of these whether it's intellectual property or the startup company, it'll be scored by the corporate selection committee. And the selection committee is really looking at a number of parameters, many of which we're talking about today. And the highest scoring startup companies will then get selected by NCET 2 to have maybe a startup development officer assigned to it to work with a corporate that then will help align the work that's done at the startup and to meet the needs of the large company, and really to try to get to commercialization quicker. That's the whole goal here, is to commercialize faster. And then the highest scoring intellectual property can also form the basis of a new startup company. And so in that case, if we do something like that, then we would form a new team around that company, perhaps pulling people from the university, from the startup, to form the startup, as well as a startup development officer and so forth. So we have to pull a team together to make that happen. Next slide, please. So the corporate members, what they do is they're providing their needs, and this is really important. So when they're looking at the intellectual property in the startups, they know what they're interested in and what they care about. So, you know, I often say, who cares? So when you have something that you think is really cool, you know, you have to ask the question, who cares? Well, these corporate members are going to tell you whether or not they care, and by scoring your intellectual property or your startup, and by that score, you're going to know whether or not they actually care. And so what this diagram is really designed to do is to show you that the startup, the corporate partner, and the startup development officer at NCET 2 are all designed to work together to develop the business plans and the milestones for the high-scoring startups and intellectual property, so that you then start to see commercialization happen at a faster pace than perhaps you would if you didn't have the corporate partner. Next, please. So what is a startup development officer? Basically, someone like myself who's been in business for a really long time. You have very technical, you have technical skills as well as business skills. You know how to, do business plans. You've worked in the professional community and have a sense of how corporates do business. And you are a liaison then between the university startup and the corporate partner. So you're a bridge, and you provide your guidance as needed, and working in both technical and the business side as it relates to the corporate partner. In other words, what we're doing at NSET 2 is representing with the startup development officer the needs of the corporate partner so that we can get things commercialized quicker, perhaps leading you to an exit faster. Next, please. So when you do this, you have to understand where you are in your technology readiness. And so this is what is known as the commercialization readiness level, CRL. And so when you start out a small startup, you really have just starting at research. So you're at ground zero, basically. And you're looking at forming intellectual property on discoveries that you may have in the laboratory. And so you really are starting very early. You're looking at, the technology, maybe making prototypes, moving through market feasibility and proof of concept work in the laboratory. A works-like prototype may bring you to a stage 4 where you've got maybe a commercialization plan for, let's say, scaling up that technology, to actually getting to a stage 5 where you're looking to get funding to actually manufacture something or validate something in the pharma world for clinical validation, to the point where at stage 6, you're looking at some sales that you have. At this point, what you'll be needing probably, and what you really qualify for, is help from angels and VCs, because they like to see sales. They're not going to support you early on. Your funding usually comes from the National Science Foundation or an organization like that, where you'll get SBIR or STTR funding early on. But then once you get to the point where you actually have sales, you're looking at angels and VCs to help you kind of get over the hump and get to that point where you can support large revenue. And ultimately, what you really want to do is exit. So that's the ultimate goal here on this scale. Next, please. So the startup development officer is really there to bridge the knowledge gap and really provide for the needs of the corporate partner, as I mentioned earlier. So this is the part of the presentation where I really take you through what is it that corporate partners want to know about startups to make a successful collaboration. What do they care about, and what is it that you have to prepare? So there's a lot of challenges that come when you work with small companies. You can go back to the next slide, yeah. There's a lot of challenges that come from going small to big. Larger companies are they present a unique set of challenges to smaller university startups because they are big. And there's a lot of things that go into this. First of all, sometimes when you're a startup, you have the fear of size, the sort of the fact that they're very big and have a lot of resources, and you're very small. So there's the sheer size difference is a little challenging. You may not know who to talk to in a large corporation. Who do I get access to talk to them, and how do I get my information to the right person? When working with bigger companies, they're very slow, but a smaller company tends to be able to execute very quickly, depending upon the company, but they generally work at a faster pace. Obviously, there's monetary differences. The large companies have great resources, whereas smaller companies are really confined to the funding that they get early on in their discovery process. And then finally, just resource allocation. Sometimes big companies can bring it and bring a lot of resources to bear on a particular problem, or they may be so busy they're not willing to do anything, and you have to bring your resources. So there's always a discussion about who does what and the resource allocation and so forth. Next slide, please. when looking at corporate partners, you know, you think as a startup that you want to look for the best market opportunity for your technology, and you really have to do a lot of homework in this area to find, you know, the key corporate players for the market. What does their market address? What verticals do they address? You may think one thing, but then you do some homework and you find out they do another. Sometimes I'm surprised at what big companies are into these days. You know, you wouldn't think Sony was in pharmaceuticals, but they are. So, you know, you have to do your homework. How do they go to market? What's their market strategy? Are they B2B or B2C? So, you know, it depends on how they go to market. So you really have to do a lot of homework on a corporate partner. And that's probably one of the biggest messages you'll see repeated over and over in this presentation today is homework, homework, homework on your corporate partner. So, you know, finding that corporate partner means looking for the right fit for your technology. The next slide, please. So what are those fundamental questions that you've got to be prepared to answer as a startup that come from corporates? What do you need to be ready to provide them? And this collaboration between the startup and a big company, the kinds of answers that you provide them really frame out how well and successful the collaboration might be. Because if you're not doing your homework, as I mentioned earlier, and you are not providing the kind of detail that they're interested in, this really could kind of set you in a bad light. So you really want to do a lot of homework, and how well prepared you answer these questions is important. And don't assume that you really know the technical direction of the corporate partner. While what they put out on their website is one thing, many corporate partners are working in the background, and you do not know what their ultimate strategies are and some of the things that they're working on that they are not ready to announce yet. So you don't necessarily know everything that they're doing. You assume it based on what you can find out. But many corporates are keeping a lot of stuff behind the scenes until they're ready to unveil it. So don't assume that you know everything. I know that's hard to figure out, but you really don't know exactly what they're working on. And then the other thing is, when you do work with corporates and you feel like you have a better technology than theirs, you really don't want to advise them how to conduct their business. That is something that corporates really detest. And, you know, that's kind of like, how dare you tell me what to do? So just be aware that that is a sensitive spot and a sore spot. I've been in many meetings with startups who tried to tell a big company, our big company, what they should be doing, and that is just not an appropriate way to approach them. So that's just a cautionary tale there. Next slide, please. So what do they want to know? All right, so people, let's start there. They want to know who you are, obviously, and how you're staffed. This is stuff you have to prepare anyway if you're getting any kind of funding from, like, say, the National Science Foundation. But in that staffing, it's really essential that you have a person who's primarily rooted in technology. Then you have people who are doing work in the laboratory or wherever that work is situated. And then, most importantly, you need somebody who has business experience, and that's why the SDO is an important piece of this equation. Because often science folks are not great business people. Sometimes you can find that is not the case, but mostly scientists are scientists and business people are business people, and they have to learn to work together in these startup organizations to really make everything flow nicely to a corporate partner. So it's essential that you have somebody who's skilled in business on a startup. They really want to know the academic and business backgrounds of everybody. And again, I stress that the business background and an academic background are two distinct skill sets. So if you're a professor who started a startup, I'm sure you're fantastic at your technical expertise, but your business skills may not be as honed because that's not simply what you were trained at. So it's great when you have a business partner who really can be strong And that's really essential for long-term survival in these cases. Next slide, please. The next thing they want to know is your source of funding. So how are you funded and for how long? So where is your money coming from? And when you have SBIR funding, it's a really good signal to large companies that you've been reviewed, that you have a good team in place. Particularly phase 2 funding is much more rigorous. And so it really tells the startup that, or the corporate partner, that you have a good team in place and that you're getting through to proof of concept and so forth. It's really great if your team has been trained in the I-Corps program as well at your university. So if you have an I-Corps program at your university, it is essential that you run through that program and learn business skills. That really helps you tailor and focus on your value proposition. And it's something I highly recommend for any startup to be involved in if you have that program at your university. Not all of them do. They also want to know, do you expect any money from them? Often you think, well, I'm going to be partnering with the big company. They've got a lot of money. They should be able to help pay for some things. So you may have some expectations around that. So you should be upfront about that. So what do you want? And how much do you want? And for what? What do you want to do? So you have to put some clarity around that. Obviously, if you just say, I think you ought to be funding us, that's not enough information. You want to be very specific. You want to have a plan in place if you feel like your corporate partner should be helping pay for some of the work that you're doing. And then they want to know, are you obligated to any other people like venture capital groups or other funders or even your university in some way for any funding? So, you know, there's just like, where are the strings tied to you in terms of funding? And so knowing all that up front helps the corporate partner understand the legs that you're standing on, which is your money, basically. The next slide, please. Very important is intellectual property. So what's the status of your intellectual property, your IP? Where are you in your process? Have you just filed or do you have something that's already been granted? Are there other countries covered besides the United States? You know, many companies are global and they love to see the fact that you can file in other major parts of the globe that are doing commerce, perhaps Europe or Japan or something like that, depending on what you're doing. But it is nice if you can cover some other parts of the world besides the United States, but they definitely want to know the scope of your coverage. The other thing is, who owns the intellectual property? Is it you? Did you license the technology from the university? Does the university still have a piece of the pie, or are you clean to practice that intellectual property? So there's, you know, rights of ownership there, who owns what. And then if it's owned by somebody else, then, you know, sometimes you license a vertical. So what technology vertical, what area, what space are you covering? Are you covering just medical, or is it medical devices, or is it just pharma, or is it pharma and medical devices, things like that. So you really want to know what verticals are covered. The next slide, please. And also the weight of your intellectual property. And by that, I mean, does your intellectual property represent an addition to existing technology, or does it raise the bar to another level of a technology? In other words, it takes it to a much greater significance. Or even better, is it a true new to the world breakthrough? And each one of these levels can mean different things to different companies. Certainly a breakthrough technology is much riskier sometimes. It needs a longer ramp-up time for commercialization, whereas an addition to an existing technology may not take as much time to ramp up and get into the marketplace. And so, you know, you have different scales here in terms of the weight of your intellectual property and in terms of where it is in commercialization time. The next slide, please. And then, of course, the relevance of your intellectual property. How much current intellectual property exists in this technology space? You really need to be able to explain this well to your corporate partner. They need to understand, is there a ton of intellectual property in this space, or are you the new guy in town? And if you have a ton of intellectual property already existing in this area, then you may have very little room to maneuver to be very differentiating. And so it just depends. So it's obviously up to the corporate partner to evaluate this with their corporate attorneys. But basically, you need to put a technology space, a little bit of a landscape analysis around your intellectual property to say there's a lot of technology in this space or there's a little. Too little technology in this space could be risky. And again, it could represent something so new that there's just not a lot to go on. So you got to do a lot more research to understand what is unknown about your technology. Sometimes when there's a lot out there, you know a lot, but when it's new to the world, you have a lot to discover yet. So that's the trade-off. Next slide, please. The next thing they want to know is where you are. Where are you in your technology roadmap? Again, we're talking about that commercialization chart we saw earlier. So you've got a roadmap. Obviously, all companies usually start there. What are we going to do and how are we going to get there? And so where are you in that timeline? If you have samples to share, you know, what kind of samples do you have to share? How much sample do you have to share? Are you just willing to show us a portion of your work, or are you willing to share a lot of your work? And obviously, you would have agreements in place for material transfer agreements and things like that in place in order to evaluate samples. Do you have a prototype system? If it's a device, is there a widget that you've built that may be of interest to your partner? So they love those kinds of things if you have them ready to go. Again, what data do you have? What work have you done to show that this works? How much data do you have? And how much more do you have to develop? So you're at point A, but you really want to be at point Z. And how much more work is that going to be? Is it going to be a year? Is it going to be 2 years? Or is it 6 months? So they really want to know a lot about your timeline and where you are in your development work. The next slide, please. Competition. So one of the things that people forget about is I've got a technology that solves a problem. Well, you really want to also understand, well, how do other people address this technology problem? What are they doing to solve this need already? And so putting some homework into that, and like, what are they doing? How are they solving it? What does the competition look like? Are there other viable options that are available to solve this problem? And what are they, and how much do they cost versus what you're providing? How are you different? How are you the same? And this is really important because a company is going to, if they want to invest in you, they want to know, all right, what are they getting? And if they can solve the problem another way at a cheaper cost, it is likely they will do that. So in order to really be special, you really need to understand how you differ from competition that solves this problem currently. Or is it a new problem? There may be a new problem that you're solving that no one's even tackled. But generally speaking, there's always another way to do things. And if you understand all those ways and you can differentiate yourself from those other ways, then you have a good angle to go at with your corporate partner. But they want to understand this right away. And I would often get that question from my managers. Why would I invest in you if I can solve this problem another way at a cheaper cost? And so this is a key area here for you to focus on. Next slide, please. One of the key things that people overlook is culture. Does your culture match theirs? And if you get along with your corporate partner, or if you're seeking a corporate partner that seems too difficult to work with, you know, there seems to be a mismatch somewhere along the way, you know, that may not work out. And you have to be realistic in that. You can't force feed a situation. So flexibility is the key. You have to be flexible to what's going on in their world. They have to be flexible to what's going on in your world. But at the same time, that there seems to always be a little bit of push me, pull you, or clashing, or just things aren't seeming to mesh as well as you'd like, then you may have a culture problem. And, you know, this incorporates, just as this little thing, this little chart shows you, is the values, the attitudes, the beliefs, the customs, and so forth. There may be a problem with culture, and that can really kill a strategy. You may have strategy all day long on how to really work with them, but if you can't seem to work together effectively, you know, that's a problem that is hard to solve. And so just be realistic in that, and that knowing that your cultures really need to mesh well. That's the perfect scenario. If you mesh well, you'll do well. The next slide, please. Again, I'm going to hammer this a little bit more about differentiation. You've got to be able to differentiate yourself from others. And one of the things that is really key to knowing your corporate partner, and we talk about homework, is that, is your technology disruptive to the momentum of others in the field? And this, the corporate partner is very much interested in. If it can disrupt their competition, they really love that. And so you really need to understand, again, this whole area in the business world of what your technology provides. And if it is very disruptive, then the corporate partner needs to understand that. How is it disruptive? How could it be a benefit to them? And knowing your corporate partner's business and how they operate and what they do, that's key to answering this question. So it's just another way to emphasize the fact that you need to understand your corporate partner to the point where your technology becomes so important to them that they can't live without you. And that's really when you become disruptive. They're very much interested in that. Next slide, please. So in the Inset 2 model, the market, you know, aligns startups from the University Demo Day, and they really are what we're trying to align with the Fortune 500s. And so, you know, basically we invite the startups to join our startup development program once we get alignment. And the startup development officers then work with the startup, the university, the corporate to get a path forward for, like, let's say a 2 to 5 year plan with milestones. And incorporated in those milestones, you'll also have your funding support. So that's really what this whole startup development officer program is about, is to find the right startups to move forward, to join into our program, get the startup development officer working with them and the corporate membership, develop the pathway, the milestones, and to help you, because of our network, get funding and so forth, to move you along as fast as possible, hopefully to get an exit. That's the big goal. The next slide, please. So with small business and startups, I'm going to differentiate between big and small here. You guys in the startup world are a great source for interesting new technologies. And, you know, you always get, you can be, get shiny object syndrome sometimes when you're looking for things, but that's why all of this homework is really valuable. And all of these, answering all these questions is very valuable, because once you go through all of these questions, you really try to get to what the real technology is and what it really provides. You can develop this at a much faster pace generally than a corporation. As I mentioned earlier, there's so much going on in corporations with key stakeholders. They move at a slower pace. You can move much faster. But because you are a small business, you may be naive about what the corporates really need. And that's why I emphasize homework, homework, homework. They are very much working out there, getting the corporation information out on their website. So you may understand what they think, what you may think you know what they want, but sometimes that's not the case. So it really takes a lot of homework. One of the things that's really important is the difference in speed and this faster pace thing. The speed differences can be a big stressor for startups, because you think, I haven't heard from them in forever, and I don't know why they're not calling me. And so you may drop something on a sample on them, and you may not hear from them for 6 months. And it may be that sample is in the queue to be tested, but you don't know that. They don't communicate very well and so forth. So that's part of the stressor. So you've got to have a lot of patience working with bigger businesses, and that's part of the startup development officer's role, is to help kind of smooth through some of those stresses and streamline the process. Next slide, please. In the bigger businesses, they have their own set of questions that they have to answer for themselves before they start partnerships. So there's a whole bunch of stuff here. It's slow for them. It's always slower in a big company. And there's, again, a lot of people that are involved in the process. You've got, not only R&D people, the management of R&D, the business people associated with R&D. Is this going to affect manufacturing? So those people are involved. So there's a lot of people who have a say in what happens in an innovation process in a big company. Another thing that's really critical are where they are in their budget cycle. If they're at the beginning of their budget cycle, they tend to always have a lot of free-flowing money, but at the end of their budget cycle, it could be tighter. So knowing where they are in their budget cycle is critical. You just sort of ask, where are you in your budget cycle? You're at the beginning or the end, because you can pretty much, and how much is allocated, how much free money is there to help me. Big companies are, they don't have a lot of patience. Again, they're very task oriented. They know what they want to do. They've got their plan, and they're working their plan. And so their patience is kind of limited. They're very cautious and risk averse. So that's why doing your homework up front, answering all these questions, and being as transparent as possible helps the corporate partner understand who you are and what you bring to the table, and try to take as much risk out of it for them as possible. Corporate partners don't communicate enough. They're very busy. You get in a situation where they don't tell you what they're doing. They never pick up the phone and call you and say, hey, this is what happened with your sample. Some are better than others. And I just know that this is a stressor as well as this communication issue. And they don't always regard startups, they regard them as more risky partners versus some of their more vendor type folks that they work with on a daily basis. So startup technologies are definitely riskier for them. And then again, as I say, they're risk averse, so you've got to work through that. So if you understand how to answer a lot of these questions, it's essential to having a successful relationship, is knowing how to answer all of these questions. So again, homework, homework, homework. Next slide, please. So in the end here, you really have to have a business case that's agreeable to all the stakeholders. You've got to spell out your expectations once you start getting into an agreement with them. You create those milestones with your startup development officer that show the progress and what are the options for going forward. It's kind of a go, no go setup so that everybody's on the same page. And the other thing that you need to understand is under what conditions will this relationship terminate. If things aren't going well and they really are upset with whatever data you're providing, or there's just not anything that they're interested in, you need to know that up front. So if you've asked a lot of questions like, well, what happens if, would we terminate at that point, then just put that down and know that, so that there's no surprises. That's really what it boils down to. You don't want to be surprised by just getting dropped right away by somebody. Next slide. The verticals that we focus on at Inset 2 are these, the pharma and medical area, whether it's medical devices or pharmaceuticals or even veterinary medicine, genetic technology, biotechnology. That's your pharma and medical vertical. Advanced manufacturing really covers material science. So basically engineering and chemistry, 3D printing, sensors, things like that are your advanced material science technologies. The clean tech vertical really covers the energy and storage areas. A lot of work going on in batteries right now, solar work, sustainability, agri, and so forth. So that's your clean tech area. Information and communication covers all of the IoT, Internet of Things, and big data. Can also include platforms for defense and DoD type information communication systems, virtual reality and artificial intelligence and so forth. And then finally, consumer platforms are really those consumer product facing companies that are interested in basically selling to big box stores, the cosmetics, the food, nutrition, personal care, so forth. The Procter & Gamble's of the world, for example, are your consumer platform facing companies. So those are our verticals that we are entertain companies or startups, if they have any of those things that align with those verticals and feel like they have a technology that would be something we would be interested in. Next slide. So we're coming to the end here, but basically this is how you engage with us. You as an organization, as a university, can submit your intellectual property, or as a startup, you can submit your startup to Inset 2. You can go to this email address and request a copy of our application forms, and then you can formally submit your submissions in the system. Additionally, if you're listening and you feel like you're a business person who would be a good startup development officer, we encourage you to get in touch with us. We want to have you on board, and there may be something that you could do with us and become engaged in a startup or several startups. So we're actively seeking these type of folks to work with us. They usually come from the corporate world and have worked in venture capital or open innovation or angel investing and so forth. So send us your resume and we would be interested in talking with you. I think that's the last slide, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, that's the last slide. Thank you, Vicki. So we'll move now to Q&A. So I'll put them up now. So thanks, Vicki, for your presentation today. I'll put up the first question now. We'll try to get as many through as many questions as we can. So our first question is NCET 2 support available for non-university small business startups?
Well, I'll take.
Go ahead. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, okay. So, the corporates are really interested in companies that could get to $100 million in a reasonable amount of time without, it being based on university or federal lab research. The likelihood of that isn't as high. I mean, they're really interested in the science, right? And commercializing that. So if you're not attached to a university, you should go to a university and find complementary IP, or go to a federal lab and find complementary IP. And then, I think you can ask the university to put you through, because we really are working through the universities. They have great networks. They do a lot. They have a lot of the research. They have, students that can graduate into the startups. They're just the best place for what we're trying to do, which is commercialize the research. And so we pretty well are working mostly with universities. There's exceptions to that, but it's not that you come directly. You would have to go through an angel investor or a VC investor or somebody like that. So it's not like a direct program, unless you have university or science, a lot of major science in your startup. Okay. Sorry, Vicky, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that's fine.
Okay.
Okay, our next question is, can an in-situ STO provide CRL 6 to 7 related funding guidance, or is it up to the startup to do the fundraising?
Well, they can certainly provide guidance. The fundraising may come from the government, or we do have a network of angel investors that we would then have discussions with. But the SDO can provide guidance in this area.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, the angel SDO is specifically to help get the funding from angels and VCs. So as Vicky mentioned, there's really 3 types of SDOs. So there's the ex-corporates, there's the serial entrepreneur, and the angel SDO. And the angel, they all have, if you think about it, they all have specific roles that we talked about in other webinars. So the angel SDO is really, that's the person on your team that would help you line it up to the venture community.
Our next question is, corporates keep their cards close to their chests. How do you get them to talk?
Yes, indeed. They do. And again, they're afraid of giving away their secrets. However, it is about collaboration and establishing trusting relationships. So if you can find someone within that organization that you can develop a good relationship with, you'll find that they loosen up over time. They will not do that initially. They really want to get to know you. There's a trust issue. They do not want to divulge any information that they feel like could ruin their chances or get to their competitors and that sort of thing. So it largely boils down to trust. So your first or second meeting, you can count on never getting anything, really. You're going to do all the talking. And it really takes a lot of long-term relationship building in order to get the trust level high enough to where they will talk. So it's a series of meetings. And again, providing all this information, if they really like all the information you're providing them, then they're more likely to warm up to you over time. So it's a process. It's not going to happen instantly. But I agree, they do keep their cards close to the chest on purpose.
Yes, and that's actually a big benefit of the SDOs to them. So that way they're anonymous, and the SDOs can actually talk more freely about what they're looking for. So that they work really, it's a long-term relationship. So the SDO is the repeat player there. They talk to them on an ongoing basis, or they actually worked for them before in some cases. So they know a lot of the strategies and the SDOs, and they get much more out of the corporates than a startup or a university will, which is basically because you're basically on the other side, right? So if they tell you too much, then the negotiations get harder. So they talk to us or to the SDOs, and we're almost we're not a broker in a sense, but we act like a friend to both sides, so that everybody could kind of talk to the SDOs from their point of view, and that person could relay information anonymously to the other.
The SDO is a bridge builder, right, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. Does NCIT2 just work through universities? How about the Small Business and Technology Development Center offices, which are around 1,000 all over the USA at universities?
I think I touched on this a little bit before. It's mostly universities just because of their networks, and they're really experts in a lot of this, especially for the big pipes that corporates are trying to develop from the federal labs and the universities. So I think I still have to stick to, yes, it's universities. If if you're connected to the Small Business and Technology Development Center, you should apply to be an SDO. And, as I said, we only accept about 25%. So you have to have, real venture capital, high growth experience. Because again, these things have to get to $100 million for the corporates to be interested in them. And so a lot of those small business and technology development centers are really not built for that kind of high growth. They're happy with anything that gets to $1 million or $2 million. That's a huge win for them. Whereas that is not going to be interesting to the corporates, and nor will it be interesting to the angels and VCs, right? They also need, basically $100 million companies. So that's really what we're building here.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question. Regarding the trust factor, can NDAs help in this regard for meaningful discussions early on?
Yes, certainly a non-disclosure agreement does help. Basically, that's just a piece of paper that says, I won't tell other people about what you told me. And it works both ways. And often in there's also a material transfer agreement kind of incorporated into that. It definitely helps because at least you have a piece of paper in place. It's basically an agreement that if I divulge your information, I can come after you. But it is really a starter. It is actually the essential starter to get the conversation going. Does that mean the trust factor? It is the first step in building the trust factor. Let's put it that way. But that building trust really is about people, relationships. Who are you discussing with? Who are you working with on an ongoing basis? And the startup development officer, as Tony mentioned, is going to have the ongoing conversations with the corporate partner. And their relationships with the corporate partner are really important on a long-term basis. But the folks within the startup have to be also perhaps working with folks in the big company with samples and testing and so forth. And again, being a good partner means honoring your commitments, being on time, and making sure that all your work is getting done when you say you're going to do it. All of those things tend to build trust over time because you've shown you're a good faith partner. And when you do that, when you exhibit good faith in your partnership, that's what's going to eventually lead to more and more discussions and opening up a little bit better dialogue. So it's just the first step to have an NDA to build that trust factor.
All right, thank you, Vicki, for presenting today, and thank you, Tony. So that's all the time we have. Again, just to repeat what Vicki said earlier about engaging with us. There are two ways, and we've been getting questions about it repeatedly through email, as well as on this webinar today. So in order for you to engage with NCET2, like we've been getting requests about, how do we get our startup funded, or how does our startup get noticed by corporates? Again, that is number one over here. You need to submit your IP or your startups to us. We do not accept like direct emails like asking for help. They need to be submitted through the system. So in order to do that, just send us an email at startupdevelopment@ncet2.org so we can send you a copy of the application form so you can prepare the information once new submissions get accepted in November. And if you're interested to be an SDO, all you need to do is send us a CV with a short note about wanting to know more about being part of the program. Again, send it to startupdevelopment@ncet2.org. All this information will be sent to you via email. It's the email address you use to register for this webinar, as well as the location of the slides and the video as soon as they're available. So again, thank you everyone for joining us today. Vicki, thank you for your time. And Tony, thank you for your time as well. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, Ria. Thank you, Vicki. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.